Hello my friends, welcome to today's video. I'm Jeanette with Vivo Vintage Designs. In today's video I am going to show you how I painted this tulip, which is one of my favorite flowers, using watercolor paints. But what's special about this video is that I have received a lot of messages from my alcohol ink followers that I have inspired them to try watercolor. So for those of you who are excuse me, new to watercolor or would like to try it, I wanted to show you how you can create a beautiful painting using inexpensive supplies. So the first thing that I'm showing you here is my Muño pan paints, and it comes with 48 colors. They have a really great variety of colors, as you can see, and I really enjoy working with this palette. It's very inexpensive. I think I paid about $40 for all those colors. And the pan paints last a really long time. And I'm using these brushes by Artegria. They're called Institution, I believe. All the products will be listed in the description box just below, so do take a look. I will add links. And if you don't see the list, click on Show More and it will expand. So I'm also using Daler Rowney, I believe that's how it's pronounced, mixed media paper. And I bought this small pad for $10. It did take, I'm in the United States, of course, so it did take about 2 weeks to get to me, but it was only $10 for, I think it was 30 sheets. And if you're a beginner in watercolor, this paper is wonderful because it allows you to blend your colors very, very easily. And I've used other mixed media paper. I do have a video where I painted, oh my gosh, I can't think of the name of the flower, but it worked well, but not as well as this paper. And for those of you who feel, well, do I have to know how to draw? No, you don't. You can very easily trace your painting. As you saw just a moment ago, all I did was paint a picture that I liked. I took some pencil and darkened the back of the paper with the pencil and then put it down on my paper, and I traced it using a pen, and it transfers the graphite from the pencil to your paper. Now once you've done that, you can use an eraser to lighten your pencil marks so that it doesn't show so much through the watercolor. So again, all the products that I'm using were very inexpensive and will last you a good long time. And for my palettes, I am just using a couple of small ceramic dishes. Any dish will do. And the colors that I'm using from the Muño pan paint set are Opera, Cold Pink, Permanent Rose, Greenish Yellow, Green Gray, Sap Green, and Yellow. And what I'm doing here is I am wetting the first section of my flower that I will paint. And this is called a wet in wet technique. So you wet one section at a time, and you don't want your paper to be too wet. You just want the paper to glisten. This is the reference photo that I'll be painting from. And I printed it out in black and white because it allows me to see where the shadows are and where I need the highlights. It gives me a good idea of the depth of color that I need in different areas. So again, I've wet down the first section of my paper, and I'm using the color Opera in a very watery consistency to put the first layer down. Now when you're working with watercolor, it's a translucent paint, so you do need to add layers. And you can see here that in my reference photo, I see that the bottom of this petal is yellow. So I'm adding a little bit of yellow, and I'm just using the tip of my brush to blend that right up into the pink that I put down before it. And this paper really makes blending a lot easier than regular water paper, for the beginner, that is. If you have some experience, then watercolor paper is the way to go. But I think that for the beginner, using this particular brand of paper really makes things a lot easier. So now I've painted in, I've put in my first layer on my first petal. Now because that is still wet, I have to work on a petal that is not near it, because if I were to wet that center petal while the one on the left is still wet, my colors would bleed one into the other. So now I'm wetting down my second section, and because this is the side that is in shadow, I will be adding a little bit darker color, and I'll be using the cold pink for that and a little bit of the yellow at the bottom. And I'm mixing my colors right into that wet area, and they'll blend really nicely, as you'll see. Now, if you're new to watercolor, when you start painting, you start adding your layers. In the beginning, the painting doesn't look good. It looks like you've messed it up. And when I first started, there were many times where I wanted to give up on the painting because it just didn't look like it was coming together the way I thought it should. But after many paintings, I realized that you need to continue with the painting and you need to add layers, because that's when everything comes together. So you can see here that I'm blending that yellow right into that darker shade of pink using the tip of my brush. And surprisingly, these brushes work really, really well. The bristles are a little bit shorter than the bristles on my more expensive brushes. And I feel that for a beginner, shorter bristles give you a little bit more control. So I really do recommend these if you're just starting out. So now I'm moving over to the petal on the left, and I'm adding a little bit of that deeper color, the cold pink, because in my reference photo I noticed that there is a bit of a shadow on that particular edge. So you can see that the petal is already dry. So I've added the darker color, wet on dry. That's what that's called. And now I cleaned off my brush, and it is damp with just clean water, and I'm using the tip of the brush to blend that color in, and you can see how easily it blends, even though the petal was already dry. So now I've let both of those sides dry, and I'm going to work on the center petal. So I'm switching over to a larger brush, and I'm wetting down that petal, going right up to the edge. These brushes have a really nice fine point, so it allows you to get close and it allows you to get into some tight areas. So again, when you're wetting down your paper, be sure not to have any puddles. If you do, you can just dry your brush off on your paper towel or your towel and blot up some of that water with the brush. And you want to give the paper just a moment to absorb that water so that you get your colors to blend better. So you can see here I'm adding a very, very light consistency of the color opera. And I keep looking at my reference photo. And now I'm adding a little bit of the cold pink where I see a little bit darker shaded area. Now I've cleaned my brush off and I have nothing but clean water. My brush is damp, and you can see that I keep cleaning it off and dabbing it on my towel to remove some of that extra water. And I'm using the tip of the brush to blend that paint in with the lighter pink that I applied before. And I've added a little bit of yellow to the bottom. And I'm just blending that in. And now cleaning off my brush and using the body of the brush to blend those colors together on that petal. And my colors look light again because this is only my first layer. And for this whole painting, I only used 2 layers of paint for the most part. Again, trying to keep it simple because I wanted it to be easy for you to follow. But you can see how nicely the colors are blending together when I use a damp brush. And just scrub the colors a little bit on the edges so it softens the edges and blends together nicely. So now I'm working on the outside of the left leaf. And I've wet down a small area. And I've picked up a little sap green mixed with yellow, because in my reference photo, that's where it's lightest or highlighted. And then I've cleaned off my brush, picked up a little bit more of the sap green by itself, and I'm blending it right into that combination of the sap green and yellow. And now I'm working wet on dry, which means that the paper is dry and the paint is wet. And I'm bringing that color down. And you can see that I am blending the colors right on the paper. I've picked up a little bit of the yellow mixed with the sap green, and I'm putting that down, cleaning off my brush and using the body of the brush to blend that in to the rest of that area. And now I've picked up a little bit of the sap green. And because the paper, that area is wet with the yellow that I put down before it, that green will blend in nicely. And in my reference photo, I see that the bottom of that leaf is a little bit darker, so I've picked up a little bit of the gray, or green gray rather, and I'm blending it in where I see it in my reference photo. So now we're going to wait for that area to dry, and we're going to move over to the right petal. I'm wetting down the area as I did in the previous petal. Making sure that the entire area is nice and wet. Again, just glistening, not puddling. You don't want it too dry and you don't want it too wet. You want the paper to glisten. And you want to make sure that you have the same amount of water in the entire area. Now here I'm showing you some of my other brushes. This is an Aqua Elite brush in a size 6, and you can see the difference in the length of the bristles. So again, I find that these paintbrushes with the shorter bristles are much easier for the beginner to use because it gives you so much more control than the longer bristles. Also, the snap of these bristles is pretty good because, for instance, my silver black velvet brushes are very soft, so there's not a lot of snap. Then I have Princeton snap brushes, which are very stiff. I really don't like those. But I find that I personally like the silver black velvet brushes to work with, but as a beginner, it might be a little bit difficult for you. So again, these brushes are perfect. So you can see I've wet down the entire area, and now I'm dropping in my color. I put down a little yellow first, mixed with some sap green, and then I went into the sap green and added it in the bottom area. And now I'm blending it into that yellow, and you can see how beautifully it blends. Now here I'm just lifting a little bit of that color of the green, and all I've done to lift some of that color, because I see that I painted in an area where it didn't belong. So I just wet my brush, dried it off a little bit on my paper towel, on my towel rather, and ran it across the area where I wanted to lift some of that green. Now here you can see I'm adding a little bit heavier consistency, and I believe that this color is the greenish, no, I'm sorry, the green gray. And I've dropped a little bit of that in there. Again, this is only the first layer. So with the next layer, we'll be adding a little bit more detail and a little bit more depth to our colors. Now this is a fold in this petal, rather leaf. And I'm adding the shadow where I see it. And then I'm picking up a little bit of the sap green and yellow mix and blending that all together. And you can see I have my paper is a little bit too wet, so I keep dabbing my brush on my towel to absorb some of that moisture on my brush. And now I'm adding in that shadow again using the green gray. So here I'm discussing, or rather trying to show you that these bristles, they hold a lot of water, which is excellent for watercolor painting. And I would say the snap is medium. So you have a lot of control. Okay, so here I am painting the center of this leaf, which in my reference photo is darker. So I've added the yellow where I see the highlight in my reference photo, and now I'm adding a darker shade of green. I believe that this was a mix of the green gray and the sap green. You can see I'm picking up a heavier consistency of the darker color, and I'm dropping it in there where I see the shadow. So now I'm working on the stem. In my reference photo, I see that in the stem there is a lot of, it's very light colored. So I've added a very watery layer of the yellow. And I also see a little bit of pink and a little shadow right underneath the head of the flower. So I'm adding the green gray and blending it in with my yellow, into my yellow, and picking up a little bit of the pink, the opera, and blending that into the green as well, and yellow. So I've added a little bit of shadow to the bottom of my stem and used a damp brush to blend the colors together. Make sure that before adding a second layer that your painting is completely dry. So now here I'm beginning to add my second layer and add more detail. So you can see I'm picking up a heavier consistency of the gray-green or green-gray, whatever it is. And I'm sharpening up the edge of the stem and adding a little bit more of that pink. Then cleaning off my brush and using the damp brush to blend those colors together with very, very little effort. So now I want to add a little bit more depth to the leaf on the left. So I am re-wetting the center of that leaf, and I want to darken it, so I've picked up the green-gray. And because it's been sitting on my palette, it's drying a little bit, and it makes it'll allow you to apply a heavier consistency. And because I wanted it just a little bit darker, I did go to my palette and pick up an even heavier consistency, as you can see. And I'm applying it to the area where I see it darkest in my reference photo. And then I've wet my brush, cleaned my brush, and it is damp. And now I'm using the brush to blend that color into the rest of that area. And then I'm picking up a little bit of the gray-green that I had on my palette, which was not as thick as the application that you just saw me apply, and I'm blending it into the rest of that leaf. And you can see how easily it blends. So now I see that there's an area where I need to lift some paint. So I was going to use this brush. It's just an inexpensive flat brush from a set that I ordered. It was detail brushes. They're not my favorite, but I do use them now and then because they are very tiny and allow you to get into some very tight spots. So I realized that the bristles were too soft. I needed something a little bit harder bristle to lift the paint. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a smaller, inexpensive brush. It's a flat brush, and what I've done is I've wet it and I'm rubbing it on the area where I want to lift the paint and using a paper towel to lift the paint off. And you can see how easily you can lighten an area. You can see now that I'm adding the second layer that the painting is actually looking better and coming together. So don't give up on your painting if you add your first layer and you think it's not coming together. Be patient. It will look better once you add more layers to it. Okay, so now I'm about to add a little bit more color to the center petal of my tulip. So I've wet down the area and I'm adding a little bit more color. This is the opera. I think it was opera mixed with the permanent rose. So my light is coming from the left, and the right side of my flower will be in shadow. So I want my colors on that side to be a little bit deeper and darker. So you can see that I'm adding a heavier consistency of that color on the right side of the flower. So here I'm just blending in those colors that I just added, softening up the edges using a brush damp with clean water. And in between, I am drying the painting with my dryer, the Revlon dryer that you've seen me use in previous videos. So now I am wetting down the petal on the left-hand side, and I see in my reference photo that there is a darker shadow in that area. So I've added a heavier consistency of the cold pink mixed with a little bit of the permanent rose. Then I'm cleaning off my brush and drying it off on my towel and using the tip of the brush to soften the edge and to blend that into the rest of the petal. And now working on the right petal, I'm adding a little bit more color. You can see it's a heavier consistency. And once I get to the bottom, where I see that yellowish green, I've just picked up a little bit on my brush and I'm blending it right in. And now I'm just lifting some of the color off. It was a little too yellow. So now I'm back to that center petal and adding a little bit more color. Just wanted to darken that right side a little bit more. And now I'm using my damp, clean brush to blend those colors in together and soften those edges. So I'm softening up those edges and blending the colors by simply wetting my brush, drying it off a little bit, and running it across the entire petal. Now I see here that my leaf is blending in too much with my stem. So I'm just darkening the edge of the stem that touches that leaf with a little heavier color, a little darker color, and then softening that edge with my damp brush. So this is the finished painting. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you give it a try. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm always happy to answer, and please give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.